The courthouse that morning felt heavier than usual, as though the very air carried the weight of judgment. People filled every bench, whispering in hushed tones, clutching newspapers, craning their necks for a glimpse of the man who had once been praised as a hero. Outside, reporters swarmed the steps, cameras flashing as they caught lawyers, officers, and family members walking into the building. Inside, the walls of polished oak and marble echoed with footsteps and murmurs. This was not just another trial. Everyone sensed something extraordinary was about to unfold. At the center of it all stood Officer Daniel Riker. Once regarded as one of the city's finest, he was now accused of misconduct during a midnight raid that left a family broken and a community divided. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore his uniform with the same crisp pride he always had. But his eyes betrayed him. They darted nervously across the room, landing briefly on the jurors, then the prosecutor's table, before settling on the judge. He tried to appear calm, but the cracks in his composure showed. Beside him sat Coda, the department's prized canine, a German shepherd whose reputation stretched far beyond the city. Known for his sharp instincts and unwavering loyalty, Coda had been involved in dozens of successful operations. His presence in the courtroom was unusual but strategic. The defense believed that showing the bond between officer and dog would strengthen their case, portraying Riker as a man who could not possibly be guilty of recklessness or cruelty. Coda, sitting tall on his haunches, gave the impression of discipline and trust. His ears twitched at every sound, his chest rising steadily, and his amber eyes scanned the room with intelligence. Across the aisle sat the victim's family. Emily Carter, a young mother, held her son close, her arm wrapped protectively around him. The boy, only 3 years old, clutched a small stuffed bear, its fur worn and matted from countless nights of comfort. His wide eyes, innocent and unblinking, took in the strange world around him: suits, uniforms, stern faces, and the sharp smell of polished wood and paper. He did not cry or speak. He simply stared. Many in the courtroom dismissed him as too young to matter in this trial. But there was something about his silence that made others shift uncomfortably. The case had drawn intense media attention. On one side were those who believed Riker was being unfairly targeted, that he was a scapegoat for broader issues within the department. On the other were people furious about the raid that had left a father imprisoned and a family traumatized. That night, doors had been smashed in, shouts had filled the air, and confusion had reigned. The justification for the raid was shaky, built on questionable intelligence. And now, the truth, or at least the version the court would accept, had to be untangled. When Judge Harris entered, the room rose. An older man with sharp features and a voice that carried authority, he surveyed the courtroom with weary eyes. He had presided over countless trials, but even he could feel the unusual tension. He motioned for everyone to sit, then nodded for the proceedings to begin. The prosecution went first. They laid out their case methodically, describing the raid as reckless, unnecessary, and traumatizing for the family involved. They spoke of Emily Carter, who had been forced to the ground while her son screamed in terror. They highlighted the absence of clear evidence that had justified the raid in the first place. The jury listened intently, some leaning forward, others scribbling notes. The defense countered with equal vigor. They painted Riker as a man of integrity, a decorated officer who had risked his life countless times to protect the community. They spoke of his years of service, the trust his colleagues placed in him, and the partnership he had with Coda, the dog who had saved lives on more than one occasion. The officer sat tall during this, nodding slightly, trying to reclaim the dignity he felt slipping away. And then came a moment no one had expected. When the handler led Coda to the front of the courtroom, the room hushed. The dog moved with discipline, his steps firm, his head held high. He stood beside Riker, alert but calm, the perfect image of loyalty. The handler gave a command, and Coda responded instantly, demonstrating obedience. The jurors nodded, impressed by the display. The defense smiled, confident that this would strengthen their argument. But as the handler began to lead Coda back, the dog suddenly stopped. His ears pricked forward, and his eyes fixed on something, or rather someone. Slowly, the room turned to see where he was looking. It was the boy. Coda's amber eyes locked on the child sitting in the front row with his mother. The room went silent, so silent that the creak of the wooden benches echoed like thunder. The boy froze, clutching his stuffed bear tighter, his gaze meeting the dog's. For a moment, neither moved. It was as though they recognized something in each other, something only they understood. The handler tugged gently on the leash, whispering a command. But Coda didn't budge. His stare remained fixed, intense, almost unsettling. The jurors shifted in their seats, glancing at one another. The judge frowned, leaning forward slightly, trying to make sense of the scene. Even the officer himself stiffened, his jaw tightening, his eyes narrowing on the boy, as if he suddenly realized the significance of the silent exchange. Emily Carter felt her breath catch in her throat. She pulled her son closer, whispering softly in his ear, but he did not look away. His small hands trembled around the stuffed bear, yet he held the dog's gaze with wide, unblinking eyes. Whispers began to ripple through the courtroom. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads, sensing a story in the making. The jury, who had moments before been nodding in approval at the dog's obedience, now looked unsettled. Something about the scene didn't feel like a mere coincidence. The judge cleared his throat and called for order, but the damage was already done. The atmosphere in the room had shifted. What should have been a routine demonstration of loyalty had turned into something eerie and inexplicable. And though no one could yet understand why, a police dog's stare at a 3-year-old boy had just changed the course of the trial. The courtroom seemed quieter after the recess, though not in a comforting way. It was the heavy, suffocating quiet of tension unspoken, of secrets waiting to surface. Every person in the room still remembered the strange moment that had just passed the way Coda, the police dog, had fixed his unblinking stare on the small child in the front row. The memory lingered like a shadow on the walls, a silent echo of something no one could quite explain. Now, it was Emily Carter's turn to testify. She rose slowly from her seat, carrying not only her own pain, but also the burden of her family's shattered life. Dressed simply, her hair pulled back into a neat bun, she looked far younger than her years suggested, as if the weight of the past few months had drained her of color and vitality. She held her son's hand tightly until the last possible moment before stepping forward. The boy looked up at her with wide, trusting eyes, then clutched his stuffed bear against his chest as she moved toward the witness stand. Emily's steps echoed on the polished floor. She avoided looking at Officer Riker, though she could feel his eyes burning into her back. The bailiff guided her to the stand, where she swore the oath with a trembling hand. Once seated, she clasped her fingers tightly together in her lap, her knuckles whitening. She looked toward the jury, then at the judge, but avoided looking at the defense table. The prosecutor rose and gave her a reassuring nod. "Mrs. Carter," he began softly, his voice measured. "Could you please describe to the court what happened the night of the raid?" Emily inhaled shakily, her chest rising with effort. She looked down at her lap for a moment before answering. "It was past midnight. I remember because my son had been crying. He has trouble sleeping sometimes. I had just rocked him back to bed when I heard this loud crash. It was so sudden. The front door it exploded inward." The jury leaned forward, their pens hovering above notepads. Emily's voice cracked, but she pressed on. There were men shouting, so many of them. Flashlights, boots, guns. They came pouring into our home like it was a battlefield. My husband ran out of the bedroom, confused, asking what was happening. Before he could even finish his sentence, they had him on the floor. She paused, swallowing hard. I screamed at them, asked who they were, what they wanted. But no one answered. They just shouted commands. My son was crying. He was so scared. He kept calling for his father, but they wouldn't even let me near him. Her words faltered. She pressed her hand to her mouth for a moment, gathering herself. The courtroom sat in tense silence. The boy shifted in his seat, his eyes wide as though reliving the memory he could not yet put into words. The prosecutor's tone softened further. And what happened to your husband? They dragged him away, Emily said, tears welling in her eyes. They told me he was under arrest, but they wouldn't say why. I kept asking, begging them to explain. But all they did was shove me back against the wall while they took him. My son, he saw it all. He saw his father forced to the ground, handcuffed, treated like a criminal. A juror dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Another shook his head grimly. Emily's voice grew firmer now, though it quivered at the edges. They told us later it was a mistake. That they had the wrong house, that the information they were given was unreliable. But how do you undo something like that? How do you erase the fear from a child's eyes when he watches his world fall apart in an instant? At the defense table, Officer Riker sat stone-faced. His lawyer shifted uncomfortably, scribbling notes but glancing up often, wary of the jury's growing sympathy for Emily. The prosecutor nodded gently. Mrs. Carter, how has this affected your family since that night? Emily's hands clenched in her lap. My son doesn't sleep through the night anymore. He wakes up screaming, crying out for his father. Every noise startles him. Every shadow makes him afraid. He won't let go of that stuffed bear because he says it's the only thing that makes him feel safe. He's 3 years old, and already he knows what it feels like to live in fear. Her voice cracked again, and she shook her head, blinking back tears. And me? I live every day knowing I couldn't protect him, that I couldn't stop it, that when he looked up at me, terrified, I had nothing to give him but empty reassurances. The courtroom was silent except for the scratching of pens on paper. Even the reporters, usually indifferent to emotion, paused their writing to glance up at her. The prosecutor let the weight of her words settle before continuing. Mrs. Carter, do you recall seeing Officer Riker that night? Emily stiffened. Slowly, she turned her gaze toward the man sitting across the room. Her eyes hardened, though her body trembled. Yes, I remember him. He was in charge. He was the one giving the orders. He looked right at me while my husband was being dragged away. He didn't look confused. He didn't look sorry. He looked like it was just another job, like we were nothing more than names on a piece of paper. A murmur rippled through the spectators. Riker shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tightening. His lawyer quickly objected, claiming speculation, but the judge overruled, allowing Emily to finish. Her hands shook now, but she steadied her voice. That night destroyed us. My husband is still fighting to clear his name. My son wakes up crying. And me. I sit here wondering how a man sworn to protect us could look at a family and treat them like enemies. She fell silent, tears slipping down her cheeks. The prosecutor gave her a moment before nodding. No further questions, Your Honor. The judge turned to the defense. Cross-examination? The defense attorney rose smoothly, buttoning his jacket. He approached Emily with a practiced calm. Mrs. Carter, I sympathize with your pain. But would you agree that police officers sometimes have to make difficult decisions based on the information they're given? Emily met his eyes with quiet strength. Difficult decisions don't mean destroying innocent families. The attorney smirked faintly, pacing. And yet, You claim to remember Officer Riker specifically? In the chaos of that night, with so many officers present, are you certain you could identify him with absolute clarity? Emily's jaw tightened. Yes, I'll never forget his face. The defense attorney paused, studying her, then nodded. No further questions. Emily was dismissed, but as she walked back to her seat, her son reached up for her immediately. She scooped him into her arms, clutching him tightly. The jury watched the reunion, the child burying his face in her shoulder, and they saw not just a witness, but a mother fighting to hold her broken world together. And though the trial was far from over, one truth had already settled in their hearts. This family had suffered, and the cause of that suffering sat just a few feet away, hiding behind a polished badge and a silent dog whose stare still lingered on the child. The atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted after Emily Carter's testimony. The jurors had leaned in, some visibly moved, others shaking their heads in disbelief at the horror she described. The prosecution had painted a vivid picture of pain, fear, and trauma, and for a moment, it seemed as though the case had already tipped against Officer Daniel Riker. But now, it was the defense's turn. Daniel's attorney, Robert Halston, rose with the kind of deliberate calm only a seasoned lawyer could muster. Tall, silver-haired, and sharp-eyed, Halston carried himself with the quiet authority of a man who had spent decades in courtrooms. He adjusted his jacket, gave a respectful nod to the judge, and then turned toward the jury with the faintest smile. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth, resonant, carefully measured. "You've just heard a heartbreaking testimony. No one here denies that Mrs. Carter and her family suffered a terrible ordeal. But this trial, this case, is not about grief alone. It is about responsibility. It is about intent. And it is about whether Officer Daniel Riker acted within the scope of his duty." He paced slowly, letting the words settle. "This man," he gestured toward Riker, "has spent more than 15 years serving the city. He has risked his life to protect innocent people, to save lives, and to uphold the very law that allows each of us to sleep safely at night. And he has not done so alone. At his side has been his partner, his most trusted ally, Coda." At the mention of his name, the German shepherd lifted his head, ears pricking forward. A ripple of curiosity moved through the jury box. "Coda," Halston continued, "is not just a dog. He is a decorated K-9, trained in search and rescue, narcotics detection, and officer protection. Together, Officer Riker and Coda have responded to countless emergencies. They've tracked missing children, apprehended dangerous criminals, and prevented lives from being lost. The bond between them is one forged in trust, discipline, and service." The defense lawyer paused, his gaze sweeping the room. "So when you hear accusations that Officer Riker acted recklessly, ask yourselves this. Does this sound like the man who would disregard safety, who would ignore his oath? Or does it sound like a man forced into an impossible situation, relying on training, experience, and the guidance of his loyal partner?" It was a powerful opening. Jurors shifted, some nodding faintly, others scribbling notes. The officer, sitting straight-backed at the defense table, regained some of his composure. He looked less like a man on trial and more like a soldier waiting to be honored. Halston called his first witness, a fellow officer who had worked with Riker for years. The man spoke with admiration, describing Riker's dedication and bravery. "I've seen him run into danger when everyone else was running out," the officer testified. "I've seen him risk his life for people he didn't even know. And Coda? That dog saved more lives than most officers I know. They're a team. A damn good one." The defense nodded approvingly. They called another witness, a community member who told the jury how Riker had once saved a child from drowning during a flood. More stories followed, each one building a picture of a man who, despite flaws, had devoted his life to others. Finally, the moment came. "Your Honor," Halston said, "we'd like to present Coda to the court." A murmur spread through the room. The handler rose, guiding Coda forward on his leash. The German shepherd moved with fluid precision, his paws striking the polished floor softly, his tail still, his eyes alert. He sat at attention beside the defense table, gaze sweeping the room. The handler gave a series of commands, and Coda obeyed flawlessly. He sat, he lay down, he barked on command, demonstrating the discipline that years of training had instilled. The jury watched with visible fascination. A few even smiled. "Ladies and gentlemen," Halston said smoothly, "what you see here is more than obedience. It is trust. This dog will not act unless he is certain. He has been trained to detect lies, threats, and danger. And throughout his years of service, Coda has never failed his handler, never faltered in his duty." The handler nodded proudly. "He can sense fear. He can sense deceit. He reacts to danger before most humans even realize it's there. That's why he's the best." For a moment, the defense had the room exactly where they wanted it, leaning toward admiration, drawn in by the image of loyalty and discipline. But then, just as in part one, something shifted. The handler attempted to guide Coda back to his spot beside Officer Riker, but halfway, the dog froze. His muscles stiffened. His amber eyes, so sharp and intelligent, scanned the room. And then, slowly, he turned his head, fixing his stare once more on the child sitting quietly with his mother. A hush fell. It was the same unblinking stare from before, steady and unnerving. The boy clutched his stuffed bear tighter, shrinking into his mother's side, but his gaze remained locked with the dog's. The child's lips parted slightly, though no words came. "Coda," the handler whispered, tugging the leash gently. "Come." But Coda didn't move. His ears twitched, his chest rose sharply, and a faint growl vibrated in his throat, not aggressive, but tense, alert, as though recognizing something no one else could. The jurors shifted, whispering among themselves. The judge tapped his gavel for silence, but the air was already thick with unease. Halston cleared his throat, forcing a smile. "Ladies and gentlemen, even the most disciplined animals can be distracted. Pay it no mind." But no one was convinced. The dog's behavior wasn't random. It wasn't the distraction of a scent or a sound. It was deliberate, focused, unshakable. And in that moment, while the defense tried to maintain control, Officer Riker's mask cracked. His jaw clenched, his eyes darkened, and his fists curled slightly on the table. He knew, though he would never admit it aloud, that Coda's stare was more dangerous than any testimony the prosecution could bring. For Coda had chosen his focus. And it wasn't the officer, the lawyers, or the judge. It was the boy. The silence grew heavier. The mother held her son tighter, whispering comfort into his ear. The child said nothing, but his wide, innocent eyes told the court more than words ever could. When the judge finally ordered a recess, the room exhaled in relief. Reporters scribbled frantically, already sensing headlines. "Police dog unnerves courtroom with strange behavior." But beneath the chatter, one truth hung in the air like smoke. The defense's strongest card, the image of loyalty, trust, and control, had just slipped through their fingers. And Coda, the dog meant to prove Riker's innocence, had instead cast suspicion deeper than any argument could erase. The courtroom settled uneasily after the defense's display. On the surface, everything should have worked in Officer Daniel Riker's favor. His attorney had painted him as a decorated officer, a man bound by loyalty to his badge and his dog. The jury had been impressed, even moved, by the testimonies of fellow officers and the flawless demonstration of Coda's obedience. But then came the stare. Even after the judge called for order, the image of Coda's unblinking eyes locked on the 3-year-old boy, lingered in every mind. The silence it created had been suffocating. Jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Reporters scribbled faster than ever. Spectators whispered behind cupped hands. A dog, they all knew, did not lie. When the recess ended, Judge Harris returned to the bench, his stern face betraying a flicker of unease. He glanced toward the handler, who still held Coda by the leash. The German shepherd sat calmly now, tail tucked neatly against his body, as though nothing unusual had happened. But those who had seen it, those who had felt the intensity of that stare, could not dismiss it as a simple distraction. The defense attorney, Halston, tried to smooth the disruption. He returned to the jury with a warm smile, his voice steady, confident. Ladies and gentlemen, animals, even the most disciplined, sometimes act unpredictably. A scent, a movement, even a child holding a toy can catch their attention. Do not let such things cloud your judgment of the facts. But the jurors weren't convinced. They had seen loyalty in Coda's obedience and something else in that strange fixation. The prosecution, keen to capitalize, stood swiftly. Your Honor, the lead prosecutor, Ms. Jane Morales, said, with the court's permission, I'd like to ask a few questions of the K-9 handler. The judge raised an eyebrow but nodded. Proceed. The handler, Officer Brooks, stepped to the witness stand, giving Coda a gentle command to stay. The dog obeyed, sitting squarely, his amber eyes still scanning the room. Morales approached with purpose. Officer Brooks, you've worked with Coda for how long? 5 years, he answered proudly. And in those 5 years, how would you describe his behavior? Disciplined, focused. Coda doesn't spook easily. He's trained to recognize threats, detect lies, and react only when necessary. He's one of the best dogs I've ever handled. Morales leaned closer. So, what do you make of his behavior earlier? Fixating on the child? The courtroom leaned in. A handler shifted, clearly uncomfortable. I can't explain it. Sometimes dogs notice things we don't. Scents, sounds, but not without reason. Morales pressed. The defense objected. Speculative. Overruled, Judge Harris said. Answer the question. Brooks sighed. No, not without reason. The words rippled through the courtroom like a cold wind. The jurors exchanged glances. The mother's arms tightened protectively around her son. Riker's jaw flexed, his composure thinning with every second. Coda, as if to confirm the tension, turned his head again slowly, deliberately, until his eyes locked once more on the child. This time, the boy whimpered softly, burying his face against his mother's shoulder. A low murmur swept the room, restrained only by the judge's sharp gavel. The prosecutor didn't push further, but she didn't need to. The moment spoke louder than words. After the handler was excused, the defense tried to regain ground by calling more character witnesses. Colleagues testified to Riker's bravery. Neighbors spoke of his kindness, and even a retired chief praised his dedication. But each time a voice rose in his defense, eyes wandered back to the boy, back to Coda, back to the invisible thread binding them together. By midday, the strain was palpable. Riker's once confident demeanor had faltered. His shoulders were tense, his lips pressed into a thin line. He avoided looking at the child altogether, as if eye contact alone might unravel him. During a short recess, reporters filed hurried updates. Police dog startles court with unexplained fixation. Is the child hiding a secret? Unsettling moment cast shadow on defense. Inside the courtroom, tension brewed thicker. When the session resumed, Judge Harris leaned forward, his voice sharp. The court reminds both counsels that this is a trial of facts. Emotional distractions will not sway my rulings, but even his warning couldn't dispel the unease. The boy, silent and small, seemed almost otherworldly in his presence. He did not speak, did not cry, only clutched his toy bear and watched. And Coda-loyal, disciplined Coda would not break his stare. Finally, Morales made her move. She rose, her eyes glinting with determination. Your Honor, in light of what has transpired, the prosecution requests that the child be considered as a potential witness. Gasps erupted across the room. The defense shot to its feet. Objection. Absolutely not. He's 3 years old. His testimony would be unreliable, inadmissible, and prejudicial. But Morales was undeterred. With respect, Your Honor, the child was present during the incident. He saw everything. And while young, his perspective may shed light on the truth that even the most disciplined dog in this courtroom seems unable to ignore. The judge's gavel cracked the air, silencing the uproar. He rubbed his temples, clearly weighing the decision. The law rarely allowed testimony from someone so young, but the strangeness of the situation hung over him like a shadow. He turned his gaze toward the boy. The child stared back, eyes wide but calm, his tiny fingers gripping the bear. Judge Harris exhaled. I will allow it, he said finally, his voice firm. The child may be called to testify. The court will exercise extreme caution in questioning, and his words will be weighed accordingly. But this court will not ignore potential truth. The room exploded with whispers, gasps, and hurried scribbles from the press. Emily Carter clutched her son tightly, tears springing to her eyes. She whispered urgently to the prosecutor, begging her not to put the boy through it. But the decision had already been made. At the defense table, Officer Riker's face drained of color. For the first time since the trial began, fear flickered across his features. He leaned toward his lawyer, whispering furiously, his hands trembling slightly. And Coda still, silent, unyielding, sat tall, eyes fixed on the child, as though guarding a secret that only the boy could speak aloud. The day's session ended in chaos, but the path forward was clear. The dog had stared. The child would speak. And the truth, once hidden in shadows, was about to step into the light. The courtroom's heavy oak doors had barely closed when Emily Carter pulled her son tightly against her chest. The boy, small and fragile, clutched his stuffed bear, his dark eyes blinking with the innocence of a child who didn't understand why dozens of strangers were staring at him. Emily's heart pounded as she whispered in his ear, though the words were more for herself and for him. It's okay, baby. You don't have to be scared. But she was terrified. The moment Judge Harris announced that her son would testify, something inside her cracked. Every protective instinct screamed at her to run to grab her child, push through the crowd, and escape the suffocating walls of that courtroom. But escape wasn't possible. Her family's future, their truth, their dignity were chained to this trial, and now, unbearably, to the fragile voice of her 3-year-old boy. Reporters swarmed the hallways during the recess, their cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward. Emily shielded her son, wrapping her coat around him, as though fabric could block the world's hunger for scandal. No questions, she muttered, pushing past the crowd. The prosecutor, Jane Morales, quickly intervened, waving security forward to hold back the press. Once inside the quiet of a side chamber, Morales turned to Emily with an expression that was both professional and tender. Emily, I know this is frightening, but your son might be the key. The jury has seen the dog's behavior. They've felt the unease. If your son can confirm what happened that night, it could turn the case. Emily's eyes filled with tears. He's 3 years old, Jane. He still mixes up colors. He thinks nightmares are real. How can you put that kind of weight on his shoulders? Morales sighed, lowering her voice. Because sometimes the truth comes clearest from those who are too young to lie about it. I promise I will be gentle. No tricks, no pressure. Just the simplest of questions. If he says nothing, we move on. But if he says something, She paused, choosing her words carefully. It could be everything. Emily shook her head, torn between fear and duty. She remembered that night vividly, the pounding on the door, the shouts, the crash of boots on the floorboards. She remembered her husband's face, pale and desperate, as he was dragged away. She remembered her son, crying in her arms, whispering something she hadn't understood till later. She had prayed he'd forget, but now the court was asking him to remember. Across the hall, Officer Riker sat with his attorney, both men rattled. Riker leaned forward, his voice sharp but hushed. They can't allow this. He's a toddler. A toddler. This is ridiculous. Halston adjusted his glasses, speaking quickly. We'll fight it, Daniel. We'll argue that any testimony is unreliable, that it risks tainting the jury. Children this age are impressionable. They'll understand. But Riker wasn't convinced. For the first time since the trial began, sweat dotted his forehead. He glanced toward the door where Emily and her boy had disappeared. His lips pressed into a thin line, jaw-clenching. If that kid says anything, it could ruin me. Halston tried to calm him, but the officer's eyes betrayed a flicker of panic, something his carefully built facade of confidence could no longer hide. When the recess ended, the courtroom filled with anticipation. The air buzzed with whispers. Spectators leaned forward, hungry for the next turn. The boy remained in the chamber with his mother, and the judge called both counsels forward. Before we proceed, Judge Harris said, I want to make it clear that the child will not be subjected to the same intensity as adult witnesses. Questions will be limited, simplified, and conducted with the utmost sensitivity. The court understands the delicate nature of this situation. The defense rose immediately. Your Honor, with all due respect, allowing this testimony opens the door to prejudice and speculation. This is not justice. This is exploitation of a toddler's innocence. Morales countered, her voice firm. The defense would rather silence the one person who may have seen the truth. The court cannot ignore a witness simply because he is young. The child was there. He saw what happened. His testimony is not prejudice, it's firsthand. The judge listened, weighing both arguments. Finally, his gavel struck. The decision stands. The child will testify. The defense may object, but the jury will decide how much weight to give his words. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Some whispered that this was reckless. Others said it was the only way justice could be served. Emily's stomach turned as she heard the ruling. She held her son closer, her voice trembling as she whispered, I won't let them hurt you. I promise. But even as she promised, she knew she couldn't protect him from what was coming. The truth demanded its voice. That night, back in their small apartment, Emily sat beside her sleeping child. The room was quiet, except for the hum of a distant traffic light outside. She brushed his hair gently, her heart breaking at the thought of what tomorrow would bring. He looked peaceful in sleep, his tiny chest rising and falling, his fingers still curled around the worn ear of his stuffed bear. She closed her eyes and remembered his words from that night, the same 2 words that haunted her. He had whispered them through sobs as she rocked him to sleep. Words she had prayed would fade with time. But they hadn't. They lived in him still. And now, the world was about to hear them. The morning of testimony came swiftly. The courthouse buzzed louder than ever, the press circling like vultures. Emily walked through the gauntlet of cameras with her boy in her arms, Morales at her side. Her son clung to her neck, silent, his wide eyes scanning the sea of strangers. As they entered the courtroom, Coda lifted his head. The dog's body tensed, his ears pricking forward. The room hushed as he let out a low, guttural whine. Once again, his eyes locked on the child. Emily froze, her breath catching. It was as if the dog understood something no human voice could say. The judge called for order. The jury leaned forward. Morales placed a reassuring hand on Emily's arm. "It's time." Emily bent down, kissing her son's forehead, whispering the words she wasn't sure she believed. "You're brave, my love. Just be yourself." The boy nodded faintly, clutching his bear, and allowed Morales to lead him toward the witness stand. Every heart in the courtroom pounded in unison. Every eye followed the child. Every soul braced for the moment when innocence would collide with truth. And in that charged silence, Emily Carter closed her eyes and prayed. Prayed that her son's 2 words wouldn't just shake the court, but would finally set them free. The sound of the judge's gavel echoed like thunder in the packed chamber. Everyone seemed to inhale at once, but no one exhaled. The weight of what was about to happen pressed down on the room like a suffocating fog. A 3-year-old child was about to testify. The boy clung to his mother's hand as they walked toward the front. His small shoes tapped lightly on the wooden floor, a fragile rhythm that carried more weight than the boots of officers who had marched through that same home on the night of the raid. In his other hand, the child held his stuffed bear, its fur matted, its button eye barely hanging by a thread. Coda, the police dog, rose slightly as they passed. His handler whispered a command, but the dog ignored it. His amber eyes locked on the boy, his chest rising and falling in a slow, deliberate rhythm. A sound escaped him, a low, mournful whine that made the hair stand on the back of every neck in the room. The judge frowned, motioning for the handler to control the animal. The handler tugged at the leash, forcing Coda to sit, but even in obedience, the dog refused to break his stare. Emily Carter bent down, kissing her son's temple. She whispered something only he could hear. The boy nodded faintly, then climbed into the witness chair, his little legs dangling far above the floor. The courtroom watched as a clerk approached to administer the oath. "Do you promise to tell the truth?" the clerk asked softly. The boy stared at her, confused. He glanced at his mother, then at the prosecutor. Finally, Morales leaned forward with a gentle smile. "It just means, can you promise to say what really happened?" The boy's head bobbed once. "Oh." The clerk stepped back, and silence reclaimed the room. Morales approached cautiously, every movement deliberate, her voice low and soothing. "Hi, sweetheart. Do you remember me?" The boy nodded, his small hand stroking the ear of his bear. "I know this is a little scary," Morales continued, "but you're very brave. I just want to ask you a few questions, and you can answer however you want." "Okay?" Another nod. The defense attorney sat forward, pen clenched tightly in his hand. Officer Riker's knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of the table. The jurors leaned closer, their faces unreadable masks of anticipation. The spectators held their breath, afraid even the rustle of fabric might disturb the fragile balance of the moment. Morales smiled warmly. "Can you tell us where you were the night the police came to your house?" The boy's brow furrowed in concentration. "At home. In my bed." "Were you awake when they came in?" "Yes." "Did you see what happened?" The boy clutched his bear tighter, eyes flickering toward his mother. Emily mouthed encouragement. He nodded again. "I saw." The tension in the room thickened. Morales pressed on gently. "Do you remember who came into your house?" The boy's gaze drifted toward the defense table. His small hand rose and pointed, not with confidence, but with the unfiltered honesty of a child, too young to mask instinct. Him. A ripple of shock tore through the spectators. Officer Riker shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tightening. His lawyer immediately rose. "Objection, Your Honor. This is leading, unreliable, and prejudicial." The child cannot even articulate context. The judge's gavel cracked. Overruled. The witness may continue. Morales took a step closer, lowering her voice. "Sweetheart, When you saw him, what did he do? The boy fidgeted, swinging his feet. He yelled. Yelled what? The boy's voice shrank to a whisper. Said my daddy was bad. The mother's eyes filled with tears, her hand pressed tightly against her lips. The jury shifted, discomfort written plainly across their faces. Morales knelt to eye level. And what happened then? The boy hesitated, his eyes darting toward Coda. The dog's ears twitched, his body tense, his gaze unwavering. It was as if the animal were silently urging him forward. The boy leaned closer to the microphone, his little voice trembling. The dog was there too. Morales softened her tone further. And what did the dog do? He barked, loud, made me scared. Were you hurt? The boy shook his head. But Mommy cried. For a moment, the silence in the courtroom was absolute. The sound of the child's voice, so small yet piercing, seemed to cut through every layer of pretense. Morales took a deep breath. This was it, the moment the prosecution had waited for. She asked her next question with care. Do you remember what you said to your mommy that night? After it was all over? The boy's eyes filled with tears. He hugged his bear close, burying his face in its fur. Emily's body tensed as she watched him struggle. The entire courtroom leaned forward, hearts pounding, breaths shallow. The boy lifted his head slowly. His lips parted. For a second, no sound came. Then, in a voice so soft it seemed to tremble in the air, he spoke 2 words. The same 2 words he had whispered that night. 2 words that carried all the weight of innocence, terror, and truth. Gasps erupted. The courtroom fractured into chaos, spectators shouting, reporters scrambling, the jury staring in disbelief. Judge Harris slammed his gavel repeatedly, his voice thundering for order. But no one could erase the sound of those 2 words. At the defense table, Officer Riker froze. His confident mask shattered, his eyes wide, lips trembling. For the first time, he looked less like a decorated officer, and more like a man cornered by truth. Coda let out a low, mournful howl, his body trembling against the pull of his handler's leash. The boy clutched his bear, his face wet with tears, but his words hung in the air, undeniable. And in that moment, the courtroom held its breath, knowing that everything had changed. The courtroom was in stunned silence, the kind of silence that presses against the chest and leaves every heartbeat audible. The 3-year-old boy clutched his worn stuffed bear, tears streaking his face, his tiny voice having just spoken the 2 words that seemed to freeze time itself. Officer Daniel Riker sat rigid, his knuckles white against the polished wood of the defense table. His eyes, wide with disbelief, darted toward the child and then to Coda. The dog, still tense, let out a low, almost mournful whine, his amber eyes fixed unwaveringly on the boy, as though awaiting the next revelation. For the first time since the trial began, a crack appeared in the defense's carefully constructed armor. Robert Halston, Riker's lawyer, leaned forward, scribbling notes furiously, trying to prepare for whatever was coming next. But nothing could prepare him or anyone for what those 2 words meant. The boy looked up at the judge, his small frame trembling, but his eyes bright. He spoke again, slightly louder, almost as if compelled by an unseen force. Bad man. 2 words, simple, innocent in form, but devastating in their implication. The murmurs that had begun to rise in the courtroom swelled into a crescendo of whispers. The jurors leaned forward in shock, their pens forgotten. Reporters scrambled to capture the words, but many were frozen in disbelief, unsure how to react. Even the judge leaned forward, his gavel hovering above the bench. Emily Carter's hand flew to her mouth. She clutched her son, tears welling in her eyes. Relief, terror, and vindication mixed in a bitter, heavy cocktail. Her son had spoken the truth. The prosecution didn't need to ask another question. The words hung in the room, undeniable, and they carried the weight of an entire narrative. The fear, the chaos, the unjust raid. Morales allowed a moment for the gravity of the situation to sink in before speaking carefully, with measured authority. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she said, her voice steady, "you've just heard from the youngest witness in this case. Innocent, honest, and without influence." These two words spoken by a child who saw everything reveal a truth that has been overlooked, ignored, and dismissed. They are the simplest and most powerful testimony we could hope for. Bad man? The room held its breath again. Coda, the police dog, stirred as if in affirmation, stepping closer to the child, his head lowering slightly. The boy reached out and touched the dog's snout, and Coda pressed his warm nose gently against the boy's hand. There was no aggression, no fear, only recognition, only understanding. Officer Riker's body tensed. He stared down at the table, his hands trembling, his face pale. He had spent decades building a reputation of honor and discipline, yet here it was all undone by a child's innocent observation and a dog's unyielding attention. The words had exposed a reality he could no longer hide. Halston rose, struggling to maintain composure. "Your Honor, I object. This testimony is unreliable. A 3-year-old cannot understand events, context, or the consequences of his words. This is prejudicial. We demand that it be stricken from the record." Judge Harris's gavel came down with authority. "Denied. The words have already been heard. The jury may weigh them accordingly. The court finds no legal basis to dismiss the testimony of this witness solely based on age. The content is factual in nature," the defense faltered. Whispers among the jurors had already begun. Some jurors exchanged quick, tense glances. They understood the implications immediately. The child had seen fear, had felt danger, and had correctly identified the source. No eloquent argument, no parade of witnesses, could erase the clarity of what a child, untutored and unpressured, had just revealed. Morales allowed a pause, then approached the boy again. "Can you tell us who you mean when you say bad man?" she asked softly, kneeling so that her voice was gentle, encouraging. The boy's small hand pointed directly at Officer Riker. "Him," he said, his voice trembling but resolute. The courtroom gasped collectively. The child's innocence left no room for doubt, no space for ambiguity. The murmurs escalated, a low roar of shock and fear filling the room. Emily's face broke into a combination of relief and terror. Relief that the truth had been spoken. Terror that her child had to bear witness to something so frightening at such a tender age. She whispered in his ear, hugging him close, but he had already lifted his head, eyes fixed on Riker, Coda still beside him. The prosecution, sensing the pivotal moment, allowed the child to speak a little further, asking what he remembered of that night. In his halting words, he described the shouts, the crashes, the fear he felt, and how the man standing before the court had seemed to him threatening and harsh. Every word he spoke reinforced the earlier statement, simple, true, undeniable. Coda's behavior throughout the child's testimony had mirrored the tension perfectly. The dog's gaze never wavered from the boy. His stance was alert, his muscles taut, his growl low but constant. To anyone in the courtroom, it was clear that the dog sensed the truth in the child's voice, the fear in his memories, and the danger that had been present that night. By the time the child returned to his mother's arms, the courtroom had been irrevocably changed. The air was thick with disbelief, admiration, and a creeping fear for Officer Riker's reputation. The jurors whispered to one another, the press scrambled to capture every detail, and spectators shifted in their seats, awed and unsettled. Riker's face remained pale, his body rigid. The defense attorney leaned over, speaking in urgent, hushed tones. "Daniel, We can't undo this. You need to think carefully about your next steps." But Riker said nothing. He only stared at the child and the dog, the two witnesses who had, in a way that words and lawyers could not, revealed the truth. Emily Carter held her son close, rocking him gently. Coda pressed his warm head against the boy's shoulder, protective and reassuring. The courtroom had witnessed a moment that was rare in legal history, moment where innocence and instinct had pierced through fear, deception, and authority. As the judge called for order and prepared the next steps of the trial, one thing was clear: nothing would ever be the same. The two words spoken by a 3-year-old, backed by the silent affirmation of a dog, had shaken the foundations of the courtroom. The truth had been spoken, undeniable in its simplicity, and Officer Riker would have to face it. The courtroom had never felt heavier. Silence hung in the air like a dense fog, each heartbeat echoing off the polished wood panels. The child's simple declaration, 2 words that carried the weight of innocence and fear, had changed everything. The jury whispered among themselves, eyes fixed on the boy, Coda, and Officer Riker, whose posture had shifted from confident to hollowed and tense. Judge Harris cleared his throat, restoring order. "Members of the jury," he said, his voice steady, "you have heard testimony from multiple witnesses, including a child who witnessed the events in question. It is now your duty to weigh all evidence, consider all testimony, and determine the outcome based on the facts." The jurors nodded, taking their notebooks, pens, and the enormity of the decision with solemn seriousness. The prosecution and defense retreated to their respective tables, both teams aware that the child's testimony had created an indelible mark on the trial's narrative. Officer Riker's face remained pale. For the first time, the reality of accountability had fully settled over him. No matter how many decorated years of service he had, no courtroom training could undo the simple, piercing truth voiced by a 3-year-old child, that fear and harm had been inflicted. Emily Carter sat with her son in her lap, holding him close. Her tiny shoulders shook with quiet relief, though tears streamed freely. She had feared this moment for months, but now she understood something profound. The truth could be small, fragile, and spoken in 2 words, but it could also be unstoppable. Coda, ever vigilant, rested his head on the boy's lap, letting the child run his fingers through his fur. The dog's presence was a silent comfort, a living testament to loyalty, courage, and the unspoken bond between human and animal. The jury returned after hours of deliberation. Each juror looked exhausted, but resolute. The 4-person stood and cleared their throat. "Your Honor, we have reached a verdict." The words seemed to hang in the room for an eternity. Riker shifted in his chair, his lawyer's hand brushing against his back, both men anticipating the impact of the announcement. The 4-person's voice was steady. "We find the defendant, Officer Daniel Riker, guilty of misconduct in the line of duty, reckless endangerment, and emotional harm to a minor." The room erupted quietly at first, then in murmurs, nods, and gasps. Emily's knees buckled slightly as she held her son closer. Tears streamed freely as she whispered words of gratitude and relief to him, her voice breaking with emotion. The judge banged his gavel for order. "The court acknowledges the verdict. Sentencing will follow, taking into consideration the severity of misconduct and the need to restore public trust. This court also recognizes the bravery of all witnesses, especially the youngest, whose testimony was invaluable." Officer Riker's shoulders slumped. His head lowered, the weight of guilt finally pressing down where no badge could shield him. He had defended himself for weeks with meticulous preparation, but the child's innocence, Coda's instincts, and the mother's unwavering testimony had revealed a truth he could not evade. After the courtroom cleared, Emily and her son stood together in the hallway. Coda walked beside them, his leash loosely held in Emily's free hand. The child's small voice spoke softly, almost to himself. "Coda helped me," he whispered. Emily knelt to meet his eyes, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "Yes, baby. He always keeps you safe." The bond between the mother, child, and dog had grown into something profound over the course of the trial. Coda had not only served the law, he had served as a bridge between innocence and justice, instinct and truth. He had chosen to focus on the child, guiding the courtroom toward clarity in a way no human testimony alone could achieve. Days after the verdict, Emily's life slowly began to regain a semblance of normalcy. Therapy sessions helped her son process the trauma, while she and her husband worked tirelessly to rebuild the sense of safety their home once held. The police department faced internal reviews and reforms, a direct consequence of the trial, emphasizing accountability and stricter protocols during high-risk operations. Riker faced a suspended sentence, mandatory counseling, and professional censure. He retired quietly, the weight of the child's words etched into his conscience permanently. Even years later, the image of Coda's unblinking stare and the boy's 2 words haunted him in quiet moments, a reminder of the impact of fear, trust, and responsibility. Emily's family eventually moved to a new neighborhood, where the night no longer carried echoes of fear. Her son slept soundly, his bear always by his side, Coda visiting regularly as a guardian and friend. In the evenings, Emily would watch him run across the yard, laughing freely, while the dog trotted faithfully beside him, a living symbol of courage, loyalty, and instinct. The trial became a case study in law schools and police academies nationwide. It was cited as an example of how even the smallest witnesses could have monumental impact, and how animals trained in service could sense truths humans might overlook. The story of the child, his mother, and Coda spread through news outlets and social media, inspiring debates, discussions, and a deeper understanding of the delicate intersection between innocence and justice. Years later, Emily would tell her son the story in a simplified way, teaching him the power of speaking the truth, even when it was frightening. "You were brave," she said, hugging him close. "Your words changed the world for us." Never forget that. And in every retelling, Coda was always there, silently watching, protective and unwavering. The scars of the past remained, but healing had begun. The mother and child found strength in their bond, in the dog's loyalty, and in the realization that even in the darkest moments, truth has a way of emerging. Justice had been served not just through the verdict, but through courage, instinct, and the power of a child's voice. And as they sat together one quiet evening, the boy's fingers stroking Coda's fur, Emily whispered softly, "We're safe now." Coda lifted his head, amber eyes reflecting the room's golden light, and let out a soft, contented sigh. For the first time since that night, the family felt complete, whole, and at peace. The child's 2 words had shaken a courtroom, changed a life, and reminded the world that courage, truth, and innocence could never be silenced.